Hello everyone. It's getting nearly in October and I've realised that I haven't done a video for a while. I think life sometimes gets in the way, and at the moment it's getting in the way a lot. Anyway, here I am, and today I want to talk about Anne Bronte. It's 200 years since her birth, and I still think that a lot of people regard Anne as the lesser of the Brontes and don't appreciate her work as much as they should. Now, about 40 years ago, I read a biography of Anne by Winifred Guerin. She wrote biographies of all of the Brontes. But of course, times has moved on, and a new book on Anne Bronte came out a few years ago by Nick Holland, In Search of Anne Bronte. And it is an incredibly well-researched and well-written book, and I can thoroughly recommend it. Nick was going to come to the Felixstowe Book Festival to talk to us this year, but of course, along with everything else, it had to be cancelled. So I'm taking the liberty of doing a talk on Anne instead, and I hope, Nick, that if you watch this, you will enjoy it. Now, I've got some notes here which I wrote some time ago when I was writing about Anne on my blog, Random Jottings. So I've got them out to remind me what to say. Out of the three Bronte sisters, Anne is regarded as the quiet sister, the one who's assumed not to be such a great writer as Emily and Charlotte, and who seem to lurk in their shadows. Now, I've always felt that Anne was very underestimated by the general public and readership because of Charlotte's portrayal of her as quiet Anne, gentle Anne, the Anne who sat by the fire and didn't say very much. Now, Charlotte was just such a passionate person. She couldn't have been more different than Anne. If you read the Gondel sagas, her heroes and her heroines in the Juvenilia, she was full of imagination. She was also very passionate, and what she really wanted, and Thackeray said this, and people now may think it's a bit sexist, but I think it was true. She longed to meet someone, fall in love and be happy, and it never really happened, not the passionate love that she wanted. Jane Eyre, when it was written, was regarded as a naughty book, and parents wouldn't let their daughters read it. Partly, I think, not just because of the love for a married man who had a wife in the attic, but the fact that Jane claimed equality with Rochester, which at the time was anathema. Now, the other sister, Emily. And Emily dominates. Everyone regards Wuthering Heights as being a masterpiece. Well, okay. I am fully prepared to get an onslaught of emails and tweets, because I've had this before when I've said that, quite frankly, I would rather have needles stuck in my eyes than read Wuthering Heights again. It may be a towering work of genius, but it's peopled with characters who don't have a single redeeming feature. Laurence Olivier and Merle Oberon in the 1930s film gave us this wonderful love story, sort of, running across the moors. Heathcliff, Cathy Heathcliff, which was just so untrue. I think, it was an abusive, masochistic relationship, and I absolutely loathed the book. I read it a couple of times, thought I'd try, but no. So don't bother writing and telling me I'm totally wrong, because people have said that to me before. Now, Anne. Charlotte and Emily had gone out to be teachers or to be governesses. They both loathed it. Emily came back very quickly from wherever she went because she seemed to sicken and pine when she was away from Haworth. A book was written many years ago about the fact that they thought she might be anorexic. Well, I disagree. I think she just didn't eat and starved herself in order to get her own way and get back to the parsonage, because as soon as she got home, she was fine. Charlotte hated it. She loathed her pupils. If you read Villette, her thoughts on her Belgian students are really quite awful. She didn't like being a governess, and I don't think her pupils could have liked her very much. But Anne decided that she was going to go out to work. She was going to be a governess. None of the family wanted her to go. They didn't think she was up to it. She was quiet, Anne. But off she went. And her experiences, her first experiences as a governess, are portrayed in Agnes Grey. And it's a small book in length, and when I first read it, I freely admit, I was a bit bored. I thought, it's all right. But then, after a few years, I read it again. And as I got to know more and more about the Brontes and reread their works, I began to appreciate it very much indeed. It is a quiet book. It doesn't have the sort of sweep and range of Jane Eyre or the passion in it. But it's beautifully written, and the portrayal of the families and what she had to put up with as a governess, well, awful. Later on, she took up a post at Thorpe Green, and she was there for quite a few years. And then, of course, the son of the house needed a tutor, so Branwell came along. And then, of course, disaster struck. Branwell began an affair with Mrs. Robinson, and the whole thing ended in Branwell being sacked and sent home, and Anne having to leave from a position that she'd held for several years and where she was appreciated. In fact, years later, her pupils did visit her at the parsonage. They thought a great deal of her. But Branwell mucked it all up. And of course we all know about Branwell descending into alcoholism and delirium tremens and getting drunk every night and generally being appalling, and witnessed this firsthand. Then she wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I love the title, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. It's got such a ring about it. And I read it, 30 odd years ago now. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was brilliant. I remember when my girls were small and they'd just gone to school, I could listen to Woman's Hour from 2 till 3 before I had to go and collect them. And at 2:45 they had the serial. And for about 2 weeks they read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Now, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is in 2 separate strands. First of all, we hear the voice of Gilbert Markham writing to an old friend, telling him about his life, how he met his wife. And then the centre of the book is the diary of Helen Huntingdon. And I remember very well that was read by, I think it was Janet Sussman. Fabulous, absolutely fabulous. Now, The Tenant is a story of an abusive marriage to a drunken husband. And it was clear that Arthur was modelled on Branwell. And her family weren't happy about this book and didn't want it published. But, as always, Anne stuck to her guns. And critics have said it's clumsy and uneven. And as I've just said, on my notes I've written, the first and last sections are in the first person of Gilbert, a young farmer who persists in his attentions to Helen when she moves to Wildfell Hall with her young son. And he refuses to be rejected, and she hands him her diary to explain the situation. The majority of the novel is then Helen's narrative, and it does come as a bit of a bump when you jump back to Gilbert, but I still loved it. Now, when Helen hears that her husband, who she finally left, only because he was beginning to corrupt their son, before then as a good, dutiful and religious wife, she stuck with him. And this was in Anne's character as well. And it was only when he began to, as I said, to make his son drink and corrupt him that Mrs. Huntingdon, Helen, decided to flee. Now, at the end of the book, she's gone back to nurse her husband. Now, you and I might think, well, serve him right, get on with it. But no, she went back to do it. And she told Gilbert not to write or be in touch with her. And then, after 16 months have passed, he decides he can't stand it anymore. He wants to go and see her. And of course, he hadn't realised that she was from a wealthy family, and that her inheritance would include all her husband's, the hall that they lived. And he said, "I will confess to you that I came here for the purpose of seeing you. But I did not know that this estate was yours until enlightened on the subject of your inheritance by the conversation of two fellow passengers in the last stage of my journey, and then I saw at once the folly of the hopes I had cherished and the madness of retaining them a moment longer." He viewed her as being way above his touch. He was just a farmer. She was moneyed. Well, of course, in the end it's all sorted out. And it all ends, and one assumes they live happily ever after. Now, when this book came out, it was a huge success. It sold very, very well indeed. And I've got a feeling that Charlotte might have been a bit miffed at this. This is purely my own personal opinion. Now, of course, as we know, Anne died when she was only 28. If I've got it wrong, I apologise, but I think it's 28. Now, even in death, Anne was strong, full of fortitude, secure in her faith, and determined to die without fuss. She went to Scarborough with Charlotte, knowing full well that when she left the parsonage she wouldn't see her father again, and she didn't want to cause him any more suffering, because in the previous 9 months they'd lost Branwell and Emily. Now, Anne's death is poignant. They were staying in a hotel at Scarborough. Ellen Nussey accompanied them. Ellen, wonderful friend to Charlotte. And she lay on a sofa in a room at the hotel and quietly passed away while a lunch party was taking place in the next room. I always find that just the contrast between the dying woman and this raucous lunch party. And before she died, she said, "Courage, Charlotte," knowing full well that Charlotte would need all the courage she possessed to get through what was coming. Charlotte returned home, and she had to spend the winter alone at Haworth with her father in the study, the grandfather clock ticking on the staircase, and the endless silence. Now, I have visited Bronte Parsonage many times, but I went once on a winter's afternoon. I was the last person there. There was nobody around because it was such a dank, bleak day, and the wind was wuthering, and the atmosphere, I can't describe the atmosphere. It really was quite haunting. And as you go in, the parlour where the three of them used to walk around and discuss what was on your left, at the top of the stairs, the grandfather clock. And Charlotte wrote this letter, and every time I read this letter, I remember that afternoon I was at Haworth. I felt that the house was all silent. The rooms were all empty. I remembered where the three were laid, in what narrow, dark dwellings never were they to reappear on earth. So the sense of desolation and bitterness took possession of me. The agony that was to be undergone and was not to be avoided came on. The great trial is when night approaches. At that hour we used to assemble in the dining room. Now I sit by myself. I cannot help thinking of their last days and their suffering. Perhaps all this will become less poignant in time. I dream of them and cannot recall them as they were in health. My nights were worse after the first shock of Branwell's death. They were terrible then, and the impressions experienced on waking were at the time such as we do not put into language. Worse seemed at hand than was yet endured. In truth, worst awaited us. And in another letter she said, "It is over. Branwell, Emily, Anne are gone like dreams, gone as Maria and Elizabeth went 20 years ago. One by one I have watched them fall asleep on my arm and closed their glazed eyes, I have seen them buried one by one, and thus far God has upheld me. Now, I'm sorry, I find it almost impossible to read those letters without getting a lump in my throat. I've got one now. But I do wonder about Charlotte sometimes, because after the deaths of her sisters, Charlotte was happy with the suggestion that new editions of their work were published. However, she didn't want The Tenant of Wildfell Hall to be reissued, and this was her verdict in a letter to the publishers. Wildfell Hall hardly appears desirable to preserve. The choice of subject in that work is a mistake. So Anne's contribution to the Bronte canon was thus downplayed and laid the foundation for the long-held attitude that Anne was the least talented of the trio. Charlotte and Emily have always been given prominence. I do wonder sometimes if Charlotte spoke of Anne and her literary works in a somewhat slighting way, because deep down she realised that her younger sister might in fact have been the most talented of them all. Now that's my theory. Whether you agree with me or not, I don't know. But I will repeat, this is a wonderful book, In Search of Anne Bronte by Nick Holland. Get hold of it and read it, you won't be disappointed. Then, of course, Agnes Grey. This is the Oxford Classics edition with a wonderful introduction and foreword. And then The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, again the Oxford Modern Classics. If you haven't read Anne Bronte, try Agnes Grey first, because the funny thing is, if you read Anthony Trollope, the Berkshire Chronicles, the first one, The Warden, I regard as sort of Agnes Grey. It seems to be a very slight little book with not a great deal going on. But it laid the foundations for what came next. And in Berkshire Towers, you get this wonderful, superb flowering of Trollope's writing. And you get the same in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I'm sorry, a lot of people might think, well, what's Trollope and Bronte got to do with each other? And the answer is, of course, nothing. It's just my personal opinion. So do read them. I think The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is a work of genius, quite frankly. It has been claimed by the sisterhood now as a feminine work, the first feminist novel. And I'm not sure Anne would have thought about that when she was writing it. I really don't. But if people want to say that, that's fine. I think she's wonderful. And I have read Tenant of Wildfell Hall probably once a year. And in fact, with the winter coming on, I think it might be time for a reread. Thanks again for listening, watching, and if you could leave any comments and any suggestions, I would be delighted to hear from you. Goodbye, everyone.